Clayton Marcells, December 3rd, 2049. I had fallen asleep completely exhausted by our activities, only to be awakened abruptly by a knock on the door. I sensed from the depths of my sleep that Angelica was getting out of the bed, and I heard the door opening and Esther's voice say, "Harris is here." I felt Angelica's return, and soon she was softly kissing me awake. "Come on, Clayton. Time to rise and shine." I opened my eyes and I saw her there leaned over me with the sheet wrapped around her in an impromptu toga. She smiled and left my side, grabbing her clothes from the floor and walking to the bathroom to dress. I lethargically lifted myself up and sighted my pants hanging over the back of an old wooden chair. Before I'd even gotten a pant leg on, Angelica appeared and walked to the door. "Can you make it downstairs?" she asked, smiling. "I'll manage," I replied as I struggled into the other pant leg, searched groggily for my shirt. I found it on the floor by the chair and reached for it with monumental effort as she left, closing the door behind her. As I shoved my arm through the sleeve, I gazed out the window at the gray winter day outside and wondered why my life could not have always been like this. Too bad there hadn't been anyone there when I was a teenager to say, "You know, you can just have a life. Just get a job and a girl. Start living, man. Deal with some problems. Cry a little bit when you feel sad. Get some goddamn friends to talk to. Forget about being some cyber mage freak show." But there hadn't been anyone like that. All I remember were people talking about opportunity. Don't pass up this opportunity. You can really make something of yourself. Yeah, I really made something of myself, but the question is, what? I carefully climbed down the creaking staircase and into the hall. I heard voices in the parlor and entered to find the entire group finally emerged from the basement and gathered with none other than Harris Levine. He stood by the fire, now decked out in steampunk attire, minus the brass goggles, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand, and he greeted me with a smile. "So we meet again, Mr. Marcells." "Yeah, long time no see, Harris. I didn't think you were the traveling type." I noticed that he wore thick leather gloves even now in the warmth of the room. "You were right. I am extremely medicated at the moment, and I must admit, I'm still uncomfortable, despite the aid of pharmaceuticals. I really didn't have much of a choice, though, as my apartment has suddenly become non-existent." I looked at the others questioningly before Angelica added, "Someone set off a bomb in his apartment building." "It won't be long until something similar happens here," Jesse said from the table where he sat with his ever-present laptop. "So what do we do?" I asked him, as Esther handed me a cup of coffee and a donut, which I accepted gratefully. "You are going with Harris, and we will remain here and deal with whatever may come." Ryan was seated by his brother, placing what appeared to be tarot cards before him in a circular pattern on the table. "I can't just leave when things are like this," I said, the thought of leaving Angelica in such a dangerous time bringing a twist of terror in my stomach. "You don't have a choice, Clay," she said, with a no-question-about-it tone. "We've got to get that thing out of your head before it kills you. Even if it means all of you getting hurt or worse. I don't think so." "Do you really think that you being here will make a difference?" Ryan said as he carefully placed another card down. "Besides, we may be safer here than you will be out there." I began to see his point. Okay, but where are we going to go? "I hope you're up for a little trip," Harris said, his weak smile barely masking the nervousness in his voice. "We're going on vacation." "What are you talking about?" "The surgery to remove these implants exists, but we've got to get out of reach of Yamashita. There are places in the world where you can get the procedure done, and Yamashita will be none the wiser." "No way. You're not actually talking about Mexico," Ryan said with a wide, devilish smile. "You mean one of those clinics where people used to go to get cheap boob jobs and such?" I was suddenly besieged by the image of some doctor performing brain surgery out of his garage with a pair of pliers and an antique jigsaw. I thought travel to Mexico was banned since the drug wars. About 2 decades previous, a small war had erupted on the border of the United States and Mexico between the DEA and the drug cartels when the U.S. had attempted to crack down on the influx of drug traffic from the South through the use of martial law. The cartels had united, formed a massive guerrilla front in an attempt to maintain control of huge drug warehouses situated almost directly on U.S. soil. Since then, the border had become a militarized danger zone. I didn't say it was going to be easy or legal. Any semblance of calm had disintegrated from Harris's features. I could tell that this was definitely not a plan he had undertaken lightly. I guessed that for him, this was akin to an epic journey of monumental proportions. As I stared at him with naked doubt, his gray eyes shone with fear. Come on, Mr. Marcells. Don't make me do this alone. I want this thing gone as much as you do. Okay. I'll go. But how are we going to get to Mexico? I have a flight to South America booked under false identities. We will then backtrack to Mexico from there. South America? I waited for someone to begin laughing and signal that this was a joke. Sesquini, Colombia to be exact, Jesse stated from whatever research he was currently engrossed in. Is that kind of out of the way? I've been researching the locations of the other known vortex points all over the globe. Yamashita has purchased each area and built a complex similar to the one in Mississippi at all but one of them. We have reason to believe that Yamashita may not be aware of its existence. Jesse still did not raise his stare from the screen as he continued typing. And it was in Colombia, I finished, feeling jet-lagged already. We have friends there, Clayton, Angelica said, sounding vaguely reassuring. Before you guys get rid of your implants, we want to see if there might be anything you can dig up. So there it was. After all I had been through, I was still on the job. And I still needed the neural implant. I would say that I was surprised, but I wasn't. These friends, are they like you? No, but you'll like them, Ryan stated. And how do you know that? The cards say so, my friend. And the cards never lie. Getting on a plane under assumed identities in this day and age was more than a gamble. It was downright insane. As we stood in the Atlanta airport, I had to completely trust my fate to Harris's expertise, and the nervous, phobic cybermage was not instilling me with a whole lot of confidence as he waited in line at the airport. No, if they catch us, the first thing they'll do is strip search us and start feeling around in our private areas with their filthy hands. He seemed to be speaking as much to himself as me. His hands were twitching with anxiety, and I noted a dew of sweat building on his forehead. I am sure they'll wear gloves, Harris. I was quickly discovering that I was the one who was going to have to reassure him of the success of his own plan. Yeah, dirty latex gloves out of some box smeared with lubricant as they violate us like prisoners. His rant was a whispered hush of growing hysteria as he began to sway from foot to foot as if he needed to urinate. So, you don't actually think this is going to work? Of course it'll work. I have implanted our new identities in the nationwide data bank myself. He seemed insulted that I had even suggested failure. Then, can you please explain to me why you seem on the verge of breaking into a dead run out of the airport? It is the possibility of failure, Clayton. He still was whispering, but his voice was tainted with intense emotional waver. I compulsively foresee varied outcomes. It's my blessing and curse. My mind automatically creates scenarios of every given probability. I don't just think, hey, this might happen. I see the occurrence as if it were a tangible experience. That must be exhausting, I said, wishing I could veer the conversation into mindless chit-chat. Oh, you have no idea, he answered, wiping the sweat from his face with his coat sleeve. He had exchanged his steampunk attire for faded blue jeans, a t-shirt, and a plain purple jacket. So, how often do you actually manage to pinpoint occurrences? Well, if I can suppress my paranoia, it's about 50-50. Usually the more rational and detached I am, the more accurate my conclusions. That's why I know this will work, because I thought about it months in advance while I was still calm. So, even though you know the odds are in your favor, you can't override your mind's propensity to visualize the possible outcomes. Exactly. Oh, I am so glad I don't have your brain. You might think that, but my brain is paying for this trip, and we are flying first class. Point taken, I said as we finally arrived at the front of the line. I watched with fascination as the troubled, manic expression of Harris's face dissipated and was replaced by quiet, calm confidence. He smiled at the desk agent and introduced us with a friendly charm that seemed to put the girl at ease as she began checking our passports. I watched with baffled amazement as what I could only assume was a well-practiced act of utter relaxation was played out before me. My admiration for the young men doubled tenfold as we were given our tickets and allowed to pass onward through security without incident. After liftoff, I immediately ordered a drink and began surfing through the movie list on the small screen positioned on the back of the chair in front of me. I was delighted to find Blazing Frontiers posted and sat back to enjoy the comedy. As I chuckled through the movie and ordered another drink, Harris eyed me with interest as he borrowed my wine glass to wash down another tranquilizer. "You seem to be enjoying yourself," he said without sarcasm. "It's my new philosophy," I answered as I reclaimed the glass of Chardonnay. It occurred to me that by drinking from the same glass as me, he was exhibiting a profound trust. "Oh, please elaborate. I need some kind of distraction." As I looked into his eyes, I realized that the fear and the paranoia were still running rampant within him. "You should know more than anyone else what it's like being what we are. You spend your entire childhood being told the risks of having one of these things, but at the same time, everyone pushes and pushes for you to get it. They do everything to create the illusion that you have a choice, but from the moment you become a candidate, you start watching your options drop off one by one. I can remember when they did the first round of testing at my school. I was just 13. You know I wanted to be an artist." "Really? I wouldn't have guessed," he answered, completely focused on everything I was saying. I was already neck deep in cyber programming, but I wanted to design holographic visualizations for virtual cyberspace. I can remember the physiologist who was giving the test telling me that I could use the neural implant to create visualizations that had never been dreamed of. It sounded so good, man. What a joke. But I guess if they told kids that they would end up being data spies for mega corporations, it wouldn't sound as appealing. How exactly did you dodge that bullet? I was a physics prodigy, and I was told through cyber neural implantation that I would be able to transgress the barriers of normal human thinking. Same con, but with a different bait. He nodded silently in painful agreement. Well, after all these years, I have come to the conclusion that I have wasted my life, and from here on, I'm simply going to exist. I will concentrate my efforts on attaining all things which are truly human, which are relationships and emotional experience, philosophical quandary, and the attainment of higher purpose. I will laugh, cry, and love. I am sick of being afraid, Mr. Mercedes. That is one reason why I want to meet these people in Brazil. I don't understand. The 3 men we're going to meet are the embodiment of what you have just described. And they're Colombian? Oh no. They are Americans originally, but they travel constantly. What do they do? They are professional musicians, like the Roses were, but truly, they are studying the vortex. They are not like anyone I have ever met before. The Roses were musicians. I was stunned and embarrassed I hadn't been privy to this information. Oh yes, they were quite popular in the electronica clubs for years, but they mostly produce now. At least that's what they were doing before their awakening. What about Ted and Esther? Theodore was the Roses' drummer and a part-time freelance gardener, and Esther was a backup singer who did in-home care for the elderly on the side. What did they call themselves? Let me think. Oh yes, they were called Saturnalia. They had a hit back in 2030 called Love This Way. Hey, I think my sister had that disc. I said, remembering the music she'd played at dinner parties. It was like bluesy, easy listening techno. That would be it. What kind of music do these three play? I believe you would describe it as neo-gothic punk. They call themselves Direwolf. They're fairly popular in Europe. They play in various clubs all over the continent. And they're psychics. Only one of them possesses the kind of abilities that our friends in Savannah exhibit. And the other two make me nervous. Doesn't everybody? Yes, they do. Would you be offended if I were to make an observation about you, Mr. Marcells? Probably, but go ahead. I have no criticisms towards the validity of your philosophical observations concerning life. But I do have doubts about your ability to follow through with upholding them. And why is that? I asked as I heard the icy poison of truth dripping from Harris's tongue. I believe that you have arrived at the conclusion that it was your choices which have led you to a feeling of inadequacy concerning your relationships and general state of existence. But let me suggest that you are no more a creation of personal choice than the color of your hair or eyes. Are you now going to tell me that I was born a soulless bastard? Because trust me, Harris, I have heard the genetic argument before. Harris smiled demurely, and by the slightly glazed-over expression in his eyes, I was guessing the sedative was finally taking hold. Is that how you see yourself? A soulless bastard, Mr. Marcells. You have exhibited one of the most stunningly soulful reactions I have ever witnessed in another human being to the death of a loved one. I would venture to say that your sister was fortunate to have someone like you in her life. You have seemingly taken on the full responsibility for her life and death to an extent that ventures on neuroses. If anything, I would say that your real problem stems from the fact that you cannot forgive yourself for being human. You are a creature of duty and responsibility as much as your sister ever was. Perhaps you have been misguided in your allegiances, but you have the capability to be one of the most loyal and self-deprecating humans I have ever met. I stared at my fellow cybermage and fought the urge to hug him. Thank you, Harris. I don't know if that's true, but it means a lot to me that you said that. I just call him like I see him, he said sleepily. I just know that I really need a friend right now, and I think you do too. I've been talking to other Weinars for years, Mr. Marcells, and I've come to the conclusion that we may be a bunch of lonely bastards, but none of us are soulless. As he spoke these last words, he was leaning back in his seat and closing his eyes. I was left with my thoughts as he began snoring. I turned back to my movie just in time to see the Arizona Kid drink a third of a bottle of whiskey in about 1 minute. Sheriff Artie looks at him and says, "A man who drinks like that without eating will eventually die." The Arizona Kid looks at him wistfully and replies, "Probably." The flight took about 5 hours, which Harris Levine spent in blissful drug-induced unconsciousness. As we neared our destination, I leaned over my companion to get a look at Bogota from his window. What I saw was one of the strangest and most beautiful cities I had ever imagined. The city was packed, sprawling metropolis nestled against rolling green mountains that loomed in a dense circle around hundreds of reaching skyscrapers, standing like monoliths beneath the clear blue sky. The city had grown to the base of the mountains, and then when expansion was no longer an option, had sprouted up in a forest of stone, steel, and glass. As we approached the El Dorado International Airport, I nudged Harris awake, and he shot upright in his seat as if he expected us to be in mid-crash. I explained calmly that we were landing, and he breathed a deep sigh of relief. Later, as we waited for our luggage, I asked, "So exactly where are we going?" "First, we will get a cab to the Transmilenio." "The what?" I asked, completely unfamiliar with the word. "We're going straight to the bus station." "You mean we're not staying here?" "Well, you could hardly expect us to find a vortex in Bogota, Mr. Marcells." "Where would you expect to find one then, Harris?" "We are going to a small town called Sesquil, where we will meet up with the others." "And what is in Sesquil?" "Laguna de Guatavita will be our destination from there." "Laguna? A lake? You've never heard of it?" "Can't say I have. It was considered sacred to the Muisca people. We believe it is the site of one of the anomalies." "Wait a minute. Is that the lake where they say people used to paint people gold and dump them in as a sacrifice or something?" "Something like that. They may have made sacrifices to the sun god Su there in ancient times. They believed it was a portal." "And it actually was?" "Maybe. We've come to the conclusion that many of the sites where vortexes were present were known by the people around them to possess supernatural qualities. We've compiled a list, including the Valley of Death in Yakutia, Siberia, Carol's Rock in the Fiji Islands, and Baalbek in Lebanon. There could be dozens, but they seem to function like volcanoes, and they're only active at certain times. And when they become active, really strange things happen. We found our way to the Transmilenio, which turned out to be a seemingly endless caravan of large red buses that departed to various destinations in the area. Waiting at the on-ramp of a large bridge-like station platform, I began to feel Harris's nervous demeanor infecting me as I was pushed and bumped by the sea of passengers in line. As we left the city and began our sojourn into the countryside, I gazed out over the rolling hills and pockets of forest with a growing sense of adventure. I was feeling better, and thanks in no small part to the help of people like Angelica, the Savannah Group, and Harris, it occurred to me that I was healing. Sesquil was a small town still retaining its colonial roots with a touristy flavor that was apparent in the numerous gift shops and eateries. I guessed that it had seen better days before the advent of the massive drug wars being fought between the United States and the Colombian cartels, in much the same vein as the conflicts in Mexico. America's war on drugs had become a never-ending conflict which had threatened to bankrupt the DEA time and time again. The Drug Enforcement Agency had become its own branch of the armed forces, with as many international police interventions as the Army, Air Force, or Navy combined. 2 presidential terms ago, the policy towards drug trafficking had turned offensive, or proactive, as they called it, and the result was invasive military strikes against cartel headquarters in numerous neighboring countries, including Colombia. Therefore, it did not seem strange that we were looked upon with a certain degree of suspicion by the many watchful eyes wherever we had gone since our arrival. It was not unheard of for the DEA to send in agents under the guise of tourists in order to infiltrate cartels. I had asked Harris where we were going to spend the night, and I was met with a terrified reply. "We'll be camping on the lake." Oh. This vacation just gets better and better. There is a place we are supposed to visit before we make our way out to the lake. "And what place is that?" I asked, watching as Harris withdrew his phone from within his coat and activated the GPS navigator. I looked at the small screen over his shoulder as he entered the phrase Carmilla Tomas Gallery in Sesquil, Colombia. Soon a map appeared with an arrow charting its way down the street. He began walking in the direction indicated by the map, and after turning a corner we found ourselves standing outside a small shop with the aforementioned phrase on a sign hanging over the door. We entered the quaint little store, and a bell rang over the entrance as we walked in. A small Hispanic girl in a plain white dress was standing behind the counter of what appeared to be an art gallery. She smiled in a very businesslike manner and said in a light, pleasing tone, "Americano?" "Si," Harris responded, once more melting into his composed alter ego. "Oh, good. Then welcome to the gallery of the late Carmela Tomas. We are the only gallery in the world where her works are available for purchase. Are you looking for a particular piece, or are you just browsing? We are tourists, and have heard a great many things about Miss Tomas's work. I'd be interested in anything you could tell me about her." "Ah, of course. My name is Nina Tomas, and I am the niece of Carmela. I am the sole heir to her estate. Carmela visited here from Manaus, Brazil in 2018 in order to paint the Guatavita Lake. At that time, she was a student and amateur landscape artist who was fascinated by the area. She so loved the town that she moved here upon graduation in 2020 and set up this shop. She painted the countryside and did portraits for tourists as a living for the next 5 years, until she began having strange dreams and visions while painting the lake. That was when she began privately creating a new series of works, which would become known worldwide after her death in 2028 of leukemia." "The bat paintings," I said aloud as I realized I had heard of the woman. "Yes. Her work had suddenly become more surrealistic, and she had begun documenting the existence of a bat creature in her work. The paintings are scenes from the life of another woman, much like herself, who slowly undergoes a transformation into a vampiric bat creature." "Fascinating," Harris said as he gazed at the multitude of paintings covering the walls of the shop. "And you sell the actual paintings here?" "What you see hanging are prints of her work, but I do negotiate sales with serious dealers and museums of her actual paintings. However, those with enough money to afford the originals are few and far between." "I imagine so. Can we see some of her work?" Harris was seemingly in a euphoric daze as the woman smiled and gestured for us to explore. "Feel free. These paintings are here for you to enjoy. She was greatly underappreciated as an artist during her life, and I consider it in my obligation to share her vision with the world." "I'm sure she is very proud of all you have done," Harris said with another one of his deeply truthful compliments, which some would mistake for sarcasm. The girl seemed to sense the bare honesty of the statement, however, and glowed with pride. The first of the paintings we encountered were prints of earlier landscapes, and I felt myself blush with shame as I thought of my comment aboard the plane about wanting to be an artist. This woman had been a true artist. Here was a person who had studied technique and style to the point of meticulous expertise. She made the scenery which she represented come alive with a vivid emotional intensity that instantly invoked a response of the mind's reaction. Looking at the sunsets and the dawns depicted over the crater-like rim of the lake, I was possessed by the feeling that I was seeing the world through the eyes of some powerful and intuitive spirit that had surpassed the basic observational quality of the 5 senses. I looked over the mountains and trees she had projected upon the canvas and saw that she had captured an energy present in the very foundations of the life she was studying, so intently that few others had ever observed, and as powerful and as moving as these scenes were, they were nothing in comparison to what was to come. Here was a young girl, no more than a child of 5, sitting on a stone in the forest with a small bat suspended from her fingers like a dark piece of jewelry dangling over the ground. Her eyes were bright and clear with delight as she might be singing to the creature. Next, the same girl was older, if only by a year, and standing at the mouth of a cave in the hills with her arms outstretched joyfully as a flock of dark winged beasts flew out around her in clouds of wings at twilight. Her simple blue skirt whirled in the breeze caused by the wind rushing from the flapping wings of the nocturnal army. The girl had become a teenager, and depicted in a series of 5 portraits, one could see a lovely young face which was changing slightly by the year into an aspect of dark animal characteristics. Her eyes were gradually becoming smaller and darker as the tips of her ears peeked out from beneath her black hair in long points. She was now a grown woman, and crouched naked in silver moonlight, with thin bones stretching and bending in absurd ways as a thin sheet of skin appeared beside her breasts and stretched out in a web to her arms. In the next painting, she stooped on a ledge overlooking a city that bore an uncanny resemblance to Bogota, which lay in a burning ruin as bats flew from the sky in massive swarms. Now she had become a majestic and horrible hybrid of bat and human features as she stood amongst concrete slabs surrounded by a darkness lit only by what appeared to be glowing green eyes peering from the shadows. The last painting was of the hybrid creature standing by the lake, enwrapped in its magnificent wings, staring at a great whirling storm which hung over the water. All around her were hundreds of human forms, all caught in a similar state of transition between human and bat, staring at what I recognized clearly as a vortex. "There are many more," the girl said from behind us. We had been so caught up in the story of the paintings that we had not noticed her presence directly behind us. "She painted close to 100 such scenes." "Incredible," I whispered, as I studied the photographic detail of each brushstroke. "She was a genius," Harris uttered under his breath, as he stared intently at the image of the vortex, painted in such realistic detail before him. He turned to her and removed a notebook from his pocket, on which he scrawled a quick note, which he handed to her along with a credit card. "I want a print of each of these works, sent to this address in the States with the quickest delivery possible." The girl's face lit up with excitement. "As you wish," she said, as she danced off to her computer. "Those are paintings of the lost earth that you were talking about," I said as I gazed once more at the image of Bogota burning. "Indeed, they are," he answered. Chapter 21. The Journal of Clayton Marcells, December 6th, 2049. We asked where we could find a ride out to the lake and were given several options. Since neither of us felt up to hiking or riding horseback, we agreed on a minibus which would drop us off near the campsites where we were to meet our contacts. Harris had grown silent and introspective since our visit to the gallery, but I was unwilling to let the discovery go so easily. So this artist was actually seeing visions of the apocalypse that destroyed the other world. Harris sighed as his expression grew troubled. "Yes and no," he answered, now seemingly to awaken from his thoughts. "I've seen pictures of Carmela Tomas. She bore a striking resemblance to the girl in the paintings. I think she was painting scenes involving her own alternate self, which existed in the other world. So, do we all have doubles in other parallel worlds? Now that is a very loaded question. Theoretically, I would say yes, but from what I have learned over the past few years, I would say not entirely. The Rose brothers say that in the world where they reincarnated, there was a text of some sort which explained in detail the mechanics of interdimensional existence, but their memory of this text is vague at best. For example, they say that if you die, you can reincarnate at any given point that is outside of an actual lifetime in which you or one of your alternate selves is existing. If you are dead and existing in a spirit state, you can travel via a portal to another reality where you exist in an alternate life, but you cannot physically reincarnate. However, you can enter that other self and ride along, so to speak, within their consciousness, although your influence is severely limited, and it can create psychic dilemmas and paradoxes within the host. You can possess your alternate self. Not really possess, but share experience. One of the problems, though, is that it tends to create a lot of doubling of consciousness, which can affect the host most negatively. The host can become overwhelmed by a constant sense of having experienced events previously or having dreamed events already. The Roses claim to have known a psychic who was tortured by a 3-minute precognition that they now attribute to being ridden by a ghost self from an alternate reality. This just gets more and more difficult to accept. Really? Even after you just saw years worth of obsessive art dedicated to an alternate life in another world? Imagine that Carmilla was actually a latent psychic, since there seems to be no other kind in our reality, who by being in such close proximity to the vortex was experiencing an ongoing trickle of information from another version of herself in the Lost Earth. It probably drove her crazy. Yes, I suppose it probably did. I'm sure that she was tortured by her visions beyond anything that we can comprehend. I think I can comprehend it pretty well. I thought of my experiences with the vortex and the hidden sphere over the past few months and felt sympathy for the artist I could not describe in words to Harris. I knew all too well what it was to experience another world and the confusion of bouncing back and forth with no anchor on which to keep from floating adrift in madness. I thought of what it must have been like for someone with no idea why or what was happening in their mind as they perceived another life and world that was completely alien to her own. Once more, the word lonely seemed to fit as a description. The bus was gradually coming to a halt as I saw my first glimpse of Laguna de Guadavita. It has long been suggested that Lake Guadavita may well be the remnant of some ancient meteor crash. Just standing there in the late afternoon gazing at the surrounding hills, it seemed an obvious conclusion based on the lake's general appearance. Spreading out in an even circle of bottomless blue water within a high valley of thick forest beneath the clear blue sky, it was like a basin one could easily envision, created from some gigantic object falling from above. It was rumored that there had been the birthplace of the legend of El Dorado. It was said that the Muisca had initiated their leaders by covering them in gold dust and having them plunge into the lake. This had spawned a belief among the Spaniards that somewhere near lay a city made entirely of gold. To date, no such city has ever been found, however. This did not stop the ambitious gold seekers from draining the lake, thereby damaging it permanently and plundering whatever remnants of ritual gold they could acquire from the shallows of the lakeside. Over time, the lake had almost been obliterated by misuse and pollution, but in time, efforts for its conservation had plugged the notch left in the mountains by the defilement of machinery and explosives, and now it had finally returned to its former water level. The area was now once more covered in a vast woodland of guayacán and cedar with closely monitored camping allowed for paying visitors. We arrived with a small group of tourists, most of who were from Bogota, led by a tour guide. We asked the tour guide if he were aware of a group of 3 foreign campers. "See," he replied with a strange smile and directed us to a hiking trail which ran along the western edge uphill into the mountains where the campgrounds were located. Harris was petrified by the presence of insects flying around, and I watched as he placed 3 of his tranquilizers in his mouth and chewed them before washing them down with his bottled water. We began our hike, and as I phased out Harris's long litany of nervous complaints concerning bugs and resident animal life, I began to truly enjoy the day. I was feeling incredibly free and alive as we made our way along the thin trail surrounded by dense trees and tall, dry grass and wildflowers. The sun was beginning to diminish beyond the upper rim of the valley. As the air cooled and fog began settling above us, the natural beauty and history of my environment was casting a spell of excitement and wonder over my troubles. Until the arrival of the Spaniards, this had been a raw and magical land of spirits and natural power. Here I was in the deep recess of our world's primal existence, with the knowledge that this magic had been more than the imaginative legends of the natives. Their world had been real, impossibly more so than ours. I was finally away from the electric, over-technological joke of modern life in one of the birthplaces of dreams. Deep shadows were stretching over the valley of the lagoon as we followed the trail, searching for the origin of a line of smoke which drifted from the trees. As we drew nearer, I could hear voices talking and see a fire flickering through the underbrush nearby. As we came around the corner, I heard a sound like guns readying to fire and froze. My hand pressed instinctively against Harris's chest. He stared at me tranquilly and smiled a stupid, drugged grin. I watched as a shadow emerged from the darkness in the wilderness at our side. Clayton Marcells and Harris Levine, I presume, came a deep, good-natured voice from the shadowy figure. Last time I checked, I joked nervously as I saw the rifle pointed at us from the stranger's shoulder. We were beginning to wonder if you were coming. We thought maybe Harry lost his nerve. The tension of my body eased as he lowered the gun to his side. I would really appreciate it if you didn't call me that, Bill. Harris sounded annoyed but calm. It's bad enough I have to deal with the intrusion of this Amazon insect armies without having to be taunted as if I were on a schoolyard in the last century. So sensitive, the man laughed as he drew closer, and I got my first clear view of him in the last light of dusk. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with long red hair and beard set in numerous complex braids which draped over his bare chest. He wore canvas pants cut off at the knee and large black combat boots, laughing joyfully as he gave Harris a good-natured shove. Come on, Harry, it's the first time I've ever met you in person, and I want you to feel at home. He slung his rifle over his muscled back and gripped Harris by his both shoulders, shaking him roughly before grabbing his neck and pulling his forehead to his own. I was trying not to laugh at the hard discomfort expressed in my companion's face as he was manhandled by the Viking. We're all friends here, Harry, and this is how I greet my friends. And with that, he engulfed Harris in a hug, which left Harris's face pressed into the man's bare, sweaty chest. As quickly as the embrace had begun, it ended, and the stranger turned to me, extending his hand. Mr. Marcells, it is a genuine pleasure to meet you. I hear tell that you have been giving the old in and out to our Miss Houston. As my own hand was engulfed in the giant's grasp, I resisted the urge to defend Angelica's honor. I guess somebody had to, I replied, bringing a throaty, rumbling laugh from my new acquaintance. Yeah, just wish it had been me, he chided, thumping me on the back as he directed us down the path. I looked over in time to catch Harris rolling his eyes as he lowered his head dejectedly. We came to a clearing where tents encircled a large campfire. Two other men, both armed, sat in camping chairs, putting their guns aside as they saw us approach. The two, also shirtless and dressed like the first, studied us calmly as Bill made introductions. Clayton Marcells and Harris Levine. This is Dylan, he said, pointing to the medium-sized young man with thick, wavy brown hair, large, shining blue eyes. And this is Rodney, he gestured to the other, a small, thin man with almost silver platinum shoulder-length hair and a wispy beard. I couldn't tell whether they looked more like musicians or a group of survivalists. They looked completely at home in the autumn, like modern air, and I had more than a little difficulty imagining them in any kind of civilized surroundings. Pleased to meet you both, the man named Dylan said with a friendly, hospitable tone. Wow, Harris, you look even more jittery and uncomfortable in person. Anybody want a beer? Bill said as he strode to a cooler and withdrew a series of clear, amber-filled bottles. Yes, Harris nearly shouted before I could even think to respond. I watched as he grabbed a bottle and began drinking it with the enthusiasm only the very thirsty or very desperate for alcohol can show. So, did you guys have a decent flight? The thin-paled Rodney said casually. Yeah, it was great. It was abysmal, Harris interjected as he plopped down in an empty chair and then eyed it suspiciously as if it might be contaminated. I watched Blazing Frontiers, I commented as I found a chair of my own and accepted an ice-cold Cordova. I love that movie, Rodney replied as he took a sip of his own. He studied me approvingly with steadfast hazel eyes. You guys saw the exhibit, right? Bill said as he made his way over to a smoking black cauldron barbecue grill and began adjusting what appeared to be fish over the flames. It's amazing to see something like that and know that we were there, Dylan added, leaning forward excitedly. I looked over at Harris, who was staring at the embers of the fire thoughtfully. You were there, I said, confused. Well, not there with her, but in that world, Rodney explained, as if this were common knowledge. They reincarnated from the lost Earth, Harris said solemnly as he stood and went to the cooler for another bottle. How much do you remember? I asked with hungry curiosity as I looked at each of their faces. Bits and pieces, Dylan said, leaning back as he stared up at the darkening sky. We remember you, Rodney said, peering at me with a strange expression of delight and subdued interest. Me? I felt a sudden jolt of panic explode in my chest as they stared at me with waiting expectations. How is that possible? I mean, I was there. Oh yeah, Bill said wryly as he seated himself across from me, the flames dancing in his dark eyes. How come no one said anything? I asked, as Harris averted his face to avoid my gaze. They didn't really know for sure, so don't get all huffy, Bill said, holding out his hand in a just calmed down manner. Things got pretty crazy there near the end, and you do look a lot different. Short hair, and his eyes are blue, Dylan said as he looked back at me as if he were seeing a ghost. All the tattoos are gone, Rodney added as he glanced at Dylan. You really don't remember any of it, do you? Dylan asked, as if it were the most absurd thing he had ever contemplated. And you never said a word, did you, Harry? Bill asked over his shoulder to Harris, who had his back turned to the group. What would I tell him? Harris said, turning slowly and rubbing his eyes wearily. Hey, by the way, I know who you might have been in your past life, but hold on. You're definitely not going to like this. You were a bad guy. As a matter of fact, you were one of the most evil people I think anyone has ever dreamed of meeting. Oh yeah, you were responsible for the destruction of an entire world. He's got a point, Rodney said serenely. No way. That is impossible. My hands were shaking as a morbid paranoia threatened to devour my mind. You know what, Mr. Marcells? If you had asked me a year ago, I would have agreed, Dylan sighed as he once more turned his stare skyward. But now, I think we have a few more important questions to discuss. Like, how did you get out? Rodney said, still watching me with amused caution. And, are you dangerous? Bill's face was now serious for the first time since meeting him. He's not dangerous, Harris said quickly as he stepped into the light of the fire. I've watched him and studied him. He's not the same person. You may not realize this, Mr. Marcells, but Harris here may be the only reason you are still alive. Hell, I think the Roses contemplated killing you as soon as you showed up in Savannah, Bill explained coldly. But old Harry here said there was a possibility that all that was not as it appeared. Reincarnation is a complicated process. You all should know that better than anyone, Harris said, taking on the demeanor of a defense attorney, arguing for his client. Yeah, but how can that kind of evil just disappear? Rodney's tone was philosophical but probing. Don't you understand that he chose to have his abilities suppressed when he agreed to the neural implant? Harris stated furiously. Yeah, and now he has chosen to have it removed, Dylan replied. Stop this, I yelled, standing with wobbly, terror-weakened legs. This just isn't right. There is no way I could have been what you are saying I was. The concept is ridiculous. I've never harmed a soul in my life. Maybe not in this life, Mr. Marcells. Dylan's eyes were hard and tainted with a barely hidden gleam of anger. I calmed myself, sat back down as I addressed them all with the reason I could muster. You cannot condemn me on the pretense that I might have been whoever you think I was in some other existence. They all sat in silence as they looked at each other in wordless conference. You should all consider that if he is here, then Watt is still locked in the house. Harris's voice was quiet and logical. And the only way we're going to find out is if Clayton remembers. Yeah, Bill muttered sarcastically. We know you guys are just dying to get those little doohickeys out of your brains. If Clayton doesn't get his removed, he will die, Harris exploded. And it was your own sister who said it needed to be done, Dylan. Harris was staring at the young man with a penetrating intensity I hadn't witnessed in him before. No, it was my sister's ghost who said that. I was now adrift in absolute confusion. Mr. Marcells, Dylan began, smooth and explanative. The woman you knew as your sister was the reincarnation of the woman I knew as my sister on the Lost Earth. Barb was originally a member of our group. She died before us and somehow discovered your rebirth and chose to be your sibling in this life, so that she could keep her eyes on you, Bill finished with a grandiose wave. And she cared for him genuinely, Harris added with an angry glance at Bill. As a matter of fact, his well-being is foremost in the thoughts of her spirit. Or doesn't that mean anything to you three anymore? Watch it, Levine. Dylan's face was a grim mask of subdued rage. You may think this is easy for us, but you have no idea what we've been through. It is true that we cannot sit here and simply tell you what happened in that other world and judge your current selves based on that. However, we and the Savannah group are all agreed that somehow the man sitting in that chair is some version, piece, or reincarnation of the snake shaman we knew as Andrew Love. The man that we called the sorcerer, who was imprisoned inside his family mansion in Mossboro, Mississippi. Barb's spirit somehow tracked him here, and we have been led to believe that may be the main purpose for all of our reincarnations in this messed up techno jungle you call a world. What we know is that this corporation has been messing with the remnants of the vortex, and now the reincarnation of the sorcerer is sitting by our campfire. So hear me out. If Andrew Love somehow managed to get a piece of himself out and back into the life cycle, and chose to live as a semi-normal person by sublimating parts of his identity with a neural implant, do you really want to pull the cork out of the bottle? You seem like an all-right guy, Clayton, Bill said apologetically with true kindness. I mean, the Roses like you, Ted and Esther like you, apparently Angelica really likes you, but are you strong enough to contend with an identity that was evil and powerful enough to obliterate a world? I answered the only way I could, with honesty. I don't know. But if what you say is true, then I would rather die than become what I was again. Harris shook his head with disapproval. Come on, Clayton. This is your life we're talking about. Exactly. My life, my soul, my choice. And I'm not willing to take the chance that I could become anything else but what I've chosen to be. This all sounds absolutely insane to me, but I've seen some really insane things in the past few months, and I'm not going to gamble with the only thing I have left, who I am. What about you, Harris? Rodney asked with a fateful, serious look at the cyber mage. I just want to be whole, and the only way I know to understand this fear inside of me is to remember. Are you sure about that, man? Rodney was now looking at Harris with concern and no small amount of doubt. You think you're going to find the answer to all your problems by remembering a lost lifetime. But I can almost guarantee you that all you'll find are more troubles, more misery, and more questions. Before you go letting some Mexican discount surgeons rip those things out of your head, why don't you listen to what we've found? We are going to need you guys. Neural implants and all. We can't hack Yamashita again. Harris sounded tired and depressed as he slumped back down in the chair, slapping at a near-flying mosquito. And we definitely can't do it from the middle of this ant farm. Rodney looked at me with the seeming hope of finding a more enthusiastic response, but I was currently fighting the urge to walk into the woods and never look back. What are you talking about? I sighed as I took off my hat and laid it on my lap. We've been traveling all over the world investigating the Yamashita compounds built at each of the Vortex sites, and they're working on something big. Bill held his hands above his head to indicate something tall. Like what? I said, trying to put aside the entire first half of the conversation with these men. The best look we got was in Siberia, at the Valley of the Dead in Yakutia. But even there, we were half a kilometer away, looking through high-powered night vision cameras. We had about a good 15 minutes to collect data before Yamashita security spotted us and opened fire. That was it. They just opened fire. Harris looked up from his despair with interest. It's not the States over there, buddy, and we were all inside their perimeter. Bill's tone was tough and cowboy-like, which brought only an eye roll and dismissive wave from Harris. Yes, I get it. You're real men and I'm inferior, so, you got pictures? Dylan reached into a backpack which hung behind his chair and withdrew a green-colored military-issue digital field notebook, which he worked at for a moment before passing it to Harris. Harris studied the screen for several minutes, his eyes squinted in concentration as he adjusted the images several times in silence. Then looking up with an expression of amazement, he said, "These are gigantic Tesla towers." "That's what I said," Rodney burst forth, punching Bill on the shoulder with his excitement. "So you were right," Dylan said stoically, "but I don't understand what that means to us." Okay, we use generators like this for the world's electrical power grid, Harris explained. The towers function as a generator and a transmitter, which harness the electrical energy of the Earth itself and then broadcast it like radio waves to the other receiver points. But the towers I'm seeing here are colossal, and they have some very significant differences in their engineering and architecture. That's because the vortex containment reactors are at the base, Ronnie said eagerly. We looked to Harris for confirmation. He's absolutely right. "Now, show him our rig," Bill said casually. "What are you talking about?" Harris raised an eyebrow of contemptuous interest. "We put together a variation of a ghost light scanner that can function from the residual energy left by the Guadavita vortex." Rodney said this with obvious pride. "That way, we can access the vortex without alerting Yamashita to our presence." I was deeply impressed. "That's why we needed you guys," Bill said with a one-sided smile. "So we can project into your device and interface with the vortex." I looked at them with simultaneous respect and resentment. Harris and I were to be their guinea pigs. "Clayton could die, you morons," Harris hissed bitterly. "You don't even know what would happen if we managed to project ourselves into the vortex." "I have a pretty good idea," I said, rubbing my temples as I contemplated my life ending with a massive brain hemorrhage. "I don't know how or why it works, but I've done it. For some reason, it's like our expertise at connecting to cyberspace makes us particularly viable for some kind of weird astral projection into the vortex. I did it once in a bathtub back in Savannah, once on the street when I was drugged with a neurotoxin. The major drawback being that there is a serial killer with an entire army of augmented ghosts hunting for us once we're in. What exactly are you hoping to find by sending us? Dylan placed his beer on a small folding table as Bill stood and began taking the grilled fish off onto a platter. The way that the young men looked at me seemed so distinctly familiar that it suddenly struck me that he bore a striking resemblance to Barb, a sister that we had shared across lifetimes. You may not believe this, Mr. Marcells, but we really don't want anything bad to happen to either of you. Every intuition I have tells me that you are not the same man that I remember from that world. And if Barb loved you as a brother, then I know you are not. But we must keep in mind the higher price to which we are sworn. If there is one thing that we have learned, it is that these energies are dangerous beyond the greatest reaches of our imagination. These anomalies can bend and reshape reality into an unrecognizable nightmare, a distorted hell of which there can be no escape. Deep down, somewhere inside, you know that what I'm saying is true as much as I do, if not more so. We need to know what is going on in the ghost world and the vortex, and Barbara hasn't returned to give us this information. She could be in trouble. I never knew her in this life, but if she is anything like the person that I remember, then that alone is enough of a reason for us to try anything to stop whatever it is that is going on within Yamashita. We can do this tonight. Are you on board? I looked deep into the wise young man's unnerving stare and knew that to turn away now would be an action of the greatest cowardice. Okay, but I'm starving, and I want some of that fish. Now that can be arranged, Bill said as he placed a little plate loaded with seasoned fish on the table at my side. What about you? I asked Harris, who sat with his face hidden in his hands. He looked up, and I saw desperation and fear that mirrored my own. I helped get this mess going, and I'm not backing down now. Maybe remembering isn't the only path to revelation for you, Rodney suggested sympathetically. Maybe it doesn't matter either way, Harris replied. Don't you see what this means? All eyes turned to Harris as he lifted the notebook and passed it to Rodney. They're building transmission towers so that they can broadcast Ghostlight. Why the hell would they do that? Bill said as he ate. A Ghostlight scanner is just a receiver like any other, but equipped with a motherboard and recording hardware. Otherwise, it functions the same way as every other receiver in our power grid. With very little modification, you could transmit Ghostlight to just about any normal receiver with transmission towers this size. You could generate Ghostlight through every power source in the world. Every light would be producing Ghostlight energy, I said, as the concept began taking hold. So all the ghosts would become visible. Rodney was staring at the image on the notebook screen with wide, nervous eyes. That's crazy. What would be the point? Bill had stopped eating and looked at each of us with confusion. I mean, all the spirits they've been dumping through the vortex would become capable of physical interaction with the material plane, right? Yamashita is a corporation. Exactly how is it profitable to make our world more like the ghost world? Because he's working both sides of the mirror, I said as I remembered a conversation with the Savannah group. And Yamashita is no longer in control of itself. By flooding our world in Ghostlight, it will effectively be like opening the vortex and letting it swallow our reality. A cold chill fell over me as I spoke these words. They shouldn't have been able to do that, Rodney said with his voice wavering slightly with shock. From the information we've gathered, there shouldn't have been any way for them to attempt an event on that scale. Unless something has changed, Dylan said, as he stood and went to his cabin-style tent. He called for Bill from within, and they emerged carrying a large contraption on two metal poles between them like an old army medical hammock. The device itself resembled a gutted 1960s box television set, complete with enormous glass tubes amongst a nest of wires and circuitry. "Are you serious?" Harris said, throwing his hands up in the air in mock surrender. "That's your ghost light converter. Why don't you just plug us into a microwave oven and we can warm up some burritos?" I had to admit the sight of their creation did not inspire confidence. "She's not the prettiest car on the lot, but she'll get you where you're going." Bill laughed as they sat the monstrosity down between us. "We'll need some kind of drug," I said, as I stooped down and began to examine their handiwork. "We'll have to be able to suppress our perception and open a link to our unconscious." "All we've got are mushrooms," Bill said, withdrawing a bag from his pocket. "Just happened to have those laying around, did you?" Harris said sarcastically. "Hey man, we don't do drugs," Bill warned Harris, against further remarks with a finger pointed inches from the cyber mage face. "Sorry," Harris whispered with shame. "I was just kidding." "I know, bro," Bill laughed, giving Harris an affectionate squeeze on the shoulder. "I forget that you guys don't really know us." "So where do we do this?" I asked, standing and trying to hide the excitement and terror I was feeling. "We're close enough to the lake to do it here." Rodney was plugging the laptop in the device and typing in a startup code, which soon had the thing humming strangely as the tubes began to glow with dim indigo light. "We've tested it twice and got some pretty good results. But you guys need to brace yourselves." "For what?" Harris asked as the tubes became solid beacons of purplish, glowing radiance. "The ghosts," Dylan said, as he nodded his head at the perimeter of the contraption's now powerful aura. The campsite, which sat high in the mountainside, had been slowly enveloped in a gray mist, which now was turned violet in the ghost light. My eyes widened with apprehension as I began to notice a swirling maelstrom of forms and figures surrounding us on all sides. As the device reached its full power, these wispy shapes became semi-opaque and recognizable as the outlines of hundreds of spirits swarmed in a dense cloud around us. We stood in the throng of the ancient and modern, the old and the young, the moderately normal and the horribly corrupted in appearance. "But we're in the middle of nowhere," Harris said, with amazed, trembling shock. "It's like this everywhere," Dylan said, as he stared at the spirits, who seemed somewhat aware of us, but only gradually noticing our presence as they drew in towards the light. "But how could no one have noticed?" I asked, as a Muisca warrior passed through our campsite and over the fire, oblivious to the flames and us. "The ghost light scanners in our reality are set to only reveal past events, remember? But this is what our friends in Georgia see all the time without their eyewear." "I'd wear goggles all the time too," I said with a nervous chuckle. "You guys better dig into that bag and dive in," Bill said, tossing me the plastic bag of stems and caps. "We don't have that much time." "What do you mean?" I said as I took a handful into my palm and placed the earthy wood-tasting fungus in my mouth. "The longer the light is on, the more aware of us the ghosts will become, and eventually they'll start trying to interact. During our test runs, they got pretty intense. Some of them will just talk, but there's quite a few that are really mixed up and confused. Eventually, the violent ones will start moving things, and it'll get real scary fast." Bill's demeanor had been nonchalant until now, and I could see the first signs of tension appearing in his brown eyes. "But what will you do then?" Harris said as he nibbled at the mushrooms as if he were going to gag. "Dylan has abilities, especially in the ghost light, but he can't even hold off the crazy ones for long." "Christ!" Harris was now supplementing the mushrooms with 3 more tablets. "I've fallen into a nightmare." We moved our chairs closer to the vise as I snatched the bottle of pills from Harris's hand. He was smaller and thinner than me, but had built a higher tolerance to the pills through regular use, so I took only 2 and washed them down with the beer. I could feel the effects of the mushrooms beginning as a comfortable feeling of warmth in my stomach as my pupils dilated and gave the night a clean, snowy look. I had taken the pills to offset the paranoia which might take hold in the presence of the encroaching ghosts. I knew I had to be calm and rational if I was to succeed in leading Harris and I into the vortex. Rodney presented us both with cables which he attached to our implants and plugged into the input jacks on their ghost light converter. "We'll only have a couple of hours," I told Harris as he gazed around with huge black pupils at the cloud of swirling human spirits. "Why is that?" he asked, through dazed, anxious delirium. "Once the mushrooms start to wear off, our minds will begin to reject the experience and will begin withdrawing from the vortex. You will have to do everything I ask once we're in. Harris, it will be similar to a trip into high cyberspace, and you can navigate in much the same way, but you have to remember that effectively we will be operating in a dream state, and you must remain lucid. If this is like my previous experiences, then I think I know how this will work, but first, we will need to identify our goal. Try to find Dee and Shaden and collect as much information as you can on the Yamashita complexes in their world," Dylan said as he stood, and taking a stick from the stack of firewood, began dragging it in a circle around us in the machine. "What are you doing?" Harris said, clasping his shaking hands together. "I'm creating a protective circle to wall the ghosts out." He then sat down beside us and closed his eyes as if in meditation. As we watched, the circle began to glow with faint violet radiance. "You guys see that too, right?" Harris said, staring dreamily at the light around him. "Any of you guys know CPR?" I said, smiling. All 3 nodded that they did, and I saw guilt in their eyes. "It's all right," I laughed sadly. "If I die, I won't blame you." They looked at each other, and I knew that this was not something they took lightly. If harm came to Harris and me, they would not be likely to forgive themselves. I found the idea oddly comforting and realized that Ryan Rose had been right. I did like them. I closed my eyes and concentrated as I began to project myself into the ghost light.